Are you thinking about building your first gaming PC in 2026, or just trying to game on a tight budget? Then you really need to understand what minimum requirements actually mean. In this video, I'll break down the true minimum specs for gaming in 2026 and help you build a PC that runs modern games without wasting money. What's the difference between minimum and recommended specs? For a lot of games, they'll list out both of these. Minimum specs is usually the bare minimum that you need to run the game on, say, 1080p and 30 FPS. The recommended specs is usually something that the developers recommend to achieve 1080p or 1440p, 60 to maybe 120 FPS. Following the recommended requirements can make a huge difference in how the game feels and having it run smoothly on your system. So what are the minimum hardware requirements for running a gaming PC in 2026? A lot of modern CPUs have elevated from the 4-core days of years past. Now, a lot of computers will have 6 or 8 cores, and that is usually a good sweet spot to be in. The higher core counts, like 12 and 16, aren't super necessary for gaming, so sticking with 6 or 8 core CPUs is your best bet. For example, good minimum CPUs would be the Intel i3 12100 CPU or the AMD Ryzen R3 4100. These can handle a lot of games, but you want to manage your expectations. For the recommended CPUs, an Intel i5 14600K or an AMD Ryzen 9600X would be a good sweet spot for high performance gaming while also staying on a relatively good budget for a lot of games. Importantly, you'll want to pay attention to your motherboard compatibility, as not all CPUs can fit in all motherboards. Paying attention to the clock speeds of newer CPUs can help you get a better CPU or potentially save a buck when the clock speeds aren't that different. Next, we'll talk about the GPU. The GPU is the most important part for gaming. It is ultimately what renders all of the graphics for your game and will be the main determining factor of how performing your computer is. For GPUs in modern games, something like the RTX 3060 or the Intel Arc B570 would be a good minimum GPU to have for a lot of modern and heavy-duty games. These typically come with at least 4 GB of VRAM, which will be enough for older or optimized titles. Now here are the recommended GPUs. An RTX 5070 will handle a lot of heavy-duty games and give you good ray tracing performance in modern games that have them. The AMD 9070 XT is also a good option for having great rasterization performance and good ray tracing performance while also being decently priced compared to the market. Some games can be more GPU intensive than others. Titles like Apex Legends, Cyberpunk 2077, or Clair Obscur Expedition 33 are very graphically intensive and benefit from a stronger GPU, and resolution matters too. 1080p is much easier to run than 1440p or 4K. Next, we'll talk about RAM. In 2026, 8 GB of RAM is an absolute minimum, though this might not be enough for a lot of modern games, though it will be enough for older titles and more esports titles. Ideally, you'll have dual channel RAM to maximize the performance with the CPU, and for newer games, you'll want at least 16 GB of RAM. The recommended specs for newer and more modern PCs would be 16 or even 32 GB of RAM. 16 GB of RAM is enough for most games and for most productivity tasks, though multitasking can be a bit of an issue if you have too many programs open at the same time. 32 GB of RAM is a recommended sweet spot for DDR5 especially, as it'll have the maximum performance of your RAM sticks, and it'll be able to handle a lot of tasks and multitasking with relative ease. Now we'll talk about storage. A traditional hard drive is no longer acceptable for gaming. At the minimum, you'll want a 512 GB SATA-based SSD, but we recommend NVMe SSDs for their much higher performance and bandwidth. 512 GB or 1 TB is a good spot for Windows and a couple games, though you'll want to expand this to handle more games if you don't want to constantly be uninstalling and reinstalling games. A lot of newer motherboards will have multiple NVMe M.2 slots to slot in multiple drives. So if your computer can handle it, having a dedicated Windows SSD and a separate drive for games can be very helpful and is recommended because should you ever need to reinstall Windows or change things around, you can save all your games on the secondary SSD and reinstall Windows without having to reinstall all your games. Now we'll talk about the motherboard. The motherboard will need to match your CPU that you've picked in both socket and chipset. For example, in our minimum requirements, an Intel 12th gen CPU will match well with a B660 motherboard. If you have an older motherboard or upgrading your CPU, make sure you've updated the BIOS to handle any CPU compatibilities that you might run into. The motherboard ultimately will not change their performance, but will help you in expanding your computer later on down the line. So pick something that you like, which has the right amount of USB ports or SSD slots that you would like. You'll never want to cheap out on your power supply. Having a nice and reliable power supply will ensure that your computer is stable and can run things smoothly without any glitches or hitches. A bad power supply unit can cause crashes in weird ways and be hard to diagnose. So it's important to get something that is of enough capacity for your hardware that you're putting in. For most computers, this looks like a 750 watt power supply, ideally 80 plus bronze rated. Recommended for a lot of newer PCs, which are more high performance, would be 850 or maybe 1000 watt power supply, which is 80 plus gold rated. The 80 plus gold rating means it's more efficient and will most likely be quieter while it's running, as it doesn't need to work as hard. So what are the software requirements for gaming in 2026? If you're still rocking Windows 10, you can probably get by with most games. That said, newer games might require Windows 11 or offer better performance for newer titles, as it expects newer features exclusive to Windows 11. Also, always make sure your GPU drivers are up to date. Outdated drivers can cause crashes on newer games, and newer drivers will include optimization optimizations for newer games to help them run their best. You can also run Linux if you're feeling ambitious, though you'll need to look at better guides to understand the potential downsides of running Linux for gaming. For beginners, we ultimately recommend sticking with Windows. Now let's talk about add-ons. These aren't mandatory, but they can make a big difference. First, the cooling for your computer and airflow. The minimum recommended airflow for a lot of cases is at least 2 fans, one for intaking cold air and one for exhausting the hot air. For more high-performance computers, you might want 6 fans or maximize the number of fans in your computer case to optimize the inflow of cold air and the outflow of the hot air. For minimum CPUs, they include a stock cooler or air coolers usually will be just fine. For example, a Thermalite Assassin is a great budget CPU cooler. For high-performance CPUs with 4 cores, a liquid cooler might be a good idea. There are a lot of great AI units on the market right now. For example, the Lean Lee Galahad series has great options in both 240 and 360 radiator sizes. Another important part of a good gaming PC is a good gaming monitor. The gaming monitor is ultimately what you're looking at when you're playing your games. A good gaming monitor will elevate your experience to a much higher degree than most people expect. When budgeting out a PC, making sure you have enough budget for a good gaming monitor is important. While you can game at 1080p with a 60 FPS monitor, it is recommended that you have a high refresh rate for model games. For monitor titles and competitive esports games, we recommend a 1440p 240Hz monitor, as those are much more affordable and very reliable for a lot of games. Let's break down the essential peripherals. A good setup isn't complete without a great gaming mouse. A modern gaming mouse with a high-performance sensor can be great for FPS games and high-performance titles where aiming is very important. Another thing would be having good headphones, as sound is very important to a lot of games. A good pair of headphones will help immerse you in your game that much better, or help you hear enemies around corners. And finally, a good mechanical keyboard can elevate your experience and make typing on your computer that much more fun and enjoyable. They also offer better performance than a lot of cheap membrane keyboards that you can buy from Best Buy. Ultimately, for your mouse, keyboard, and headphones, we can't recommend any one product specifically because a lot of people's hands and heads are different. So you have to find one that's comfortable for you and ultimately best for the games you want to play. These items won't improve your FPS, but will elevate your gaming performance in ways you might not expect.